Warpugs, it's time. Continue on this journey with me, if you will, through Janovich telling us the story of Vraks. It is one of the best lore series that I have come across in terms of presentation, with 40k being involved. I absolutely love this so far. We're about to get into the Void Battle of Vraks. Now, there has been so much stuff written about Vraks. There's a reason I haven't done a lore video on it. There's a reason I haven't done a series of lore videos on it. And it's because it has already been done so many ways, and in so many ways better than I currently could do it. It is what it is in that regard. I do like to make my own lore videos. In fact, when I put this in the renderer, I'm going to be working on a video about the Avatar of Cain. That's going to be out later, hopefully this week. But for stuff like this is awesome. And it blows anything I'm currently capable of out of the water. Now, one of these days, maybe I'll be able to do something approaching this. But for right now, I'm just going to sit back and enjoy. Guys, if you have not subscribed to Janovich yet, you owe it to yourself to do so. Let's get into it.
For 10 years, the siege of Vraks had relentlessly raged on. Whenever the Death Corps attacked, the Vraksians counterattacked. There had been victories and defeats for both sides. But through sheer determination and unmatched sacrifice, the Death Corps of Krieg had managed to overwhelm the Vraksian outer and second defensive lines.
Hold on a second. For some reason, everything just comes up at 360p, and I don't know why. There it is. That should be a lot crisper.
The unexpected intervention by Grand Master Azrael and his brother Astartes of the Dark Angels had even seen the Vraksian starport and bridges to the east completely destroyed. Although the defenders had given the Imperial troops a fight at every turn, the Vraksian forces had now been forced to retreat back to their inner defensive line. Should this last line of defense be lost, the citadel itself would come under direct attack, and then finally, the heretical Cardinal Zaphon could be brought to justice. In fact, the citadel had already come under threat from Krieg's long-range artillery cannons, but the gruesome attrition suffered during Lord Zhulka's big push had almost completely depleted the Death Corps munition stockpiles. These would take considerable time to restock, but High Command ordered that whatever shells could be spared should be fired directly at the citadel itself. Every so often, several long-range artillery shells flew over no man's land. These wouldn't land on enemy trenches, but rather batter down on the void shields that covered the citadel. The material effect of this bombardment was ultimately negligible, as it caused next to no damage.
Psychological effect, though? Massive.
It would take more than an occasional barrage to bring down the Vraksian void shield defenses. But High Command argued that seeing the heart of the Vraksian stronghold come under artillery fire before their very eyes would be good for the Death Corps morale. They had fought hard, and it was well beyond time to see the fruits of their labor. While at the same time it would dishearten the Vraksians and convince the defenders that the Imperium's final victory was already as good as guaranteed. Command of the 88th Siege Army hoped that this show of force would convince some of the Vraksian frontline troops that further resistance was futile. There would be no point in prolonging the conflict, and perhaps the frontline troops could be persuaded to save their own skins and surrender rather than fight.
Yeah, but we don't see the saving of the own skins actually working now, do we? None of us are convinced of that.
Not that anyone expected the Imperium to spare the lives of these heretics should they surrender.
True.
But that was a different matter altogether. And besides, for the Death Corps forces on the ground right now, there was not much else to do but to dig in and prepare for the next big assault. Due to the never-ending frontal wave attacks ordered by Lord Commander Zhulka, many of the 88th Siege Army's veteran troops had lost their lives in the fighting. Almost 1 million Death Corps soldiers lay freshly dead on the Van Meersland wastes.
Oh, God.
Their corpses intermingled between countless fallen defenders, husks of destroyed tanks, as well as pulverized bunkers. After sustaining these crippling amounts of casualties, almost all of the siege regiments had been allowed some period of time to rest, to build defenses, as well as retrain and rearm themselves. Fresh recruits from Krieg were continually streaming in, but for now there wouldn't be much combat as both sides desperately needed to rebuild their strength before being able to operate effectively once more. At the very least, the Earthshaker shells harmlessly clashing against the Vraxian Void Shield would give some indication to the protective barriers.
I love how he has gradually taken the symbols of the Death Corps cores and brought them back up to, you know, the visually full strength by taking the icon of them and basically repairing it over time. I love that.
His effectiveness. Perhaps one of the void layers could be made to shudder, or even better, collapse for a period of time. This would indicate some of its potential weaknesses and provide High Command with valuable information to exploit when the real bombardment would finally take place. And so the artillery shells continued to clash against the Void Shield.
What happened to that one of the 12th line?
But although Cardinal Zaphon could for the first time personally witness himself on the receiving end of the Death Corps' long-range artillery, he wasn't nearly as desperate as the 88th Siege Army's command had hoped.
It's love.
He had been assured by Lord Arcos that sufficient reinforcements would soon depart for Vraks to relieve the siege and repel the invaders. They would only have to hold out until they arrived. But although the arrival of reinforcements had been promised, the time of their arrival remained unclear.
Come on. Look at the face. You can trust that. You can trust that. Really.
But the Cardinal's confidence wasn't merely based on blind trust in the Alpha Legionnaire's promises. Once Zaphon had overcome his initial panic at the breakthrough of the second defensive line, he recollected himself and assessed the situation with his commanders. Although 2 defensive lines had already been broken, the Death Corps had paid an extremely heavy price in blood and material to do so. The retreat to the inner defensive line had also significantly reduced the length of the front lines. Zaphon's army had also taken a lot of casualties during the big push, but now with far less ground to cover, his remaining troops would be able to hold the much shorter front line more effectively.
Okay.
Material and men could swiftly be sent across the front lines wherever and whenever they were required, and this would significantly improve the potential speed and effectiveness of Vraxian counterattacks. The inner defensive line, being some of the oldest defenses on Vraks, also boasted notably stronger defenses than the other 2, and seemingly did not have any weak points. It was a heavily defended zone of up to 8 kilometers deep, filled to the brim with concrete bunkers and reinforced trench lines. And unlike the other lines, it could also count upon the support of the Citadel's laser defense silos. Although these lasers' primary purpose was to target ships in lower orbit, these particular stations could be turned to face horizontally and serve as long-range artillery against ground targets.
And
their devastating firepower was not something to be ignored.
Yeah, that would ruin your day quite effectively to have something that's meant to shoot down ships shoot at you. That would screw up every plan that you had for the future.
So it was likely the Death Corps would focus fire on them first. But these guns had been designed to withstand bombardment from orbit, so it was unlikely that any ground-based artillery would easily be able to take them out. Not only that, but his once relatively inexperienced Vraxian militia were now all veterans of a 10-year-long war. Many had been on the receiving end of countless Death Corps
thought I heard something.
artillery bombardments, bayonet charges, and armored assaults, and yet they had survived. The relentless pounding they had suffered at the hands of the Death Corps had hardened them into grizzled and ruthless veterans. It had been inevitable that they learned, and even adopted, some of their enemy's tactics, and these were being used to good effect in the endless counterattacks they had been ordered to perform. They would never truly match the Death Corps' battle doctrine and siege experience, but the Vraxian forces had become a fighting force capable of performing complicated combined arms tactics that rivaled the skills of many of the Imperium's Imperial Guard regiments. And above all, Vraks' munitions and weapons stockpiles were still plentiful enough to supply these troops for many years to come. Their morale remained high because in their eyes, they fought for a just cause to defend their planet against an invader. Zafin estimated that with these odds, the inner defensive line could hold out at least several more years, perhaps even decades. Who knew what would happen in such a time frame? If the 88th Siege Army expected that this pathetic excuse of a bombardment against the Citadel would make the Vraxians consider surrender, they were severely mistaken. Meanwhile, the psychic beacon conjured up by Lord Arcos and his Alpha Legion sorcerers radiated strongly from Vraks into the warp. And fortunately for the defenders, it had been received loud and clear by the entities within the Eye of Terror. For the followers of the ruinous powers, it was understood that such a powerful beacon could only have been sustained with the direct endorsement and blessing of their dark gods. This was clearly a promise of slaughter and plunder as had not been witnessed in the Skara sector for a long time.
And this is where we get to Chaos Warp shenanigans. Hooray!
The followers of Chaos would not willingly let such an opportunity pass by, especially a frontier so close to their base of operations. And so a numerous and eager collection of traitors, renegades, pirates, mutants, and other warp monstrosities assembled within the Eye of Terror. Although Chaos followers aren't known for either their cooperation or caution,
No.
if they wished to reach Vraks in safety, they would have to work together. All known straits around the Eye of Terror are guarded by formidable Imperial Navy patrols to keep the forces of Chaos from venturing out. A single Chaos ship going out alone was frankly a suicide mission, and thus they combined their forces to form a single large armada to begin their perilous voyage towards Vraks.
No.
If they made haste, perhaps they would be able to reach the planet before the Imperial Navy could respond with force. And so unbeknownst to the Imperium, more than 20 heavily armed ancient battleships encrusted in unholy runes, some of them from an age even before the Horus Heresy and preserved by dark magic, streamed out of the Eye of Terror with great speed. It wasn't long before one of the Imperium's secret observation posts, Station DM498066, had spotted the unusual activity. The mysterious vessels remained unidentified for now, but according to protocol, the station sent out a warning signal to the High Command of Battlefleet Scaris of a potential Chaos raiding fleet leaving the Eye of Terror. The Imperial Navy sent out several patrol ships to gather further detailed information about this raid, and most importantly, to figure out their destination. But so far the information did not suggest anything out of the ordinary. Chaos raiders frequently tried their luck, venturing outside of the Eye in hopes of catching Imperial transport ships off guard for easy plunder. Usually dispatching a small navy force was enough to intercept and stop these raids. But the Ordo Malleus of the Inquisition was always suspicious of anything that moves near the vicinity of the Eye of Terror. Sent out a null ship to investigate. Such a ship was essentially a one-way probe. Crewed by automated servitors and a single blank, it was invisible in the warp, and thus untraceable for the Chaos forces. It would be able to come much closer than any other patrol ship without being detected, and with its powerful augers, it could scan the Armada in great detail. Once it had approached close enough, the scanners were activated and identified the enemy's forces. The Inquisition's worries had been confirmed. It was indeed a large Chaos fleet. Many of the Chaos vessels were at least cruiser size or larger.
Oof.
Since its initial discovery by the observation post, it had managed to rendezvous with even more raiding ships. So far, up to 30 individual vessels had been identified. Such a large enemy presence had not been witnessed for some time in this region of space, and thus it seemed that the sector would have a big problem on their hands.
Yep.
Several Imperial Navy cruiser groups were put on high alert and made ready in anticipation to intercept this worrisome Chaos Armada. In order to bring enough firepower to challenge and ultimately destroy the vast amount of Chaos ships, even the mighty Emperor-class battleship Constantine Valdor was ordered to mobilize and prepare itself for major action.
There's a name I haven't heard in 10,000 years.
But now, the multiple data points about the Chaos Fleet had been collected and analyzed. Its heading was calculated, and the estimations seemed to confirm that the enemy was heading straight for Vraks with great speed.
Yeah.
To prepare a navy force formidable enough to challenge such a large raid would take a lot of time. This was time that did not have, since Vraks was one of the planets on the outskirts of the Scarus sector. As it were, Battlefleet Scarus was frankly caught with its pants down. Despite their best efforts, it would remain to be seen if they could intercept the enemy forces before they reached their destination. Back on Vraks, the remaining ships holding the blockade around the planet were informed of the frenetic activity of Battlefleet Scarus. Admiral Raziak had received orders to stand ready against the threat of Chaos Raiders in the sector. Unfortunately, over the 10-year-long siege, Raziak's forces had been deemed superfluous in the otherwise quiet sector. His fleet and crew had been reduced to the absolute minimum in order to supply material and men to more demanding sectors. All the vessels available to him now was a single escort squadron of 3 Sword-class frigates, 3 defense monitor stations, and of course his own flagship, a Luna-class cruiser named the Lord Bellerophon. All of these ships would be able to stand their ground in terms of firepower, but they had been stripped of men and operated on skeleton crews. Their constant escort duties had also worn the ships down, and they were in need of maintenance. Of course, in hindsight, reducing Raziak's available forces had been a grave mistake, but this would not help him now that the enemy was well on their way.
Okay, so there are so many different arenas that they need to go through. The Scarus subsector is just one subsector in countless subsectors. There's so many damn subsectors, it's stupid. And there's conflicts going on in each and every one of them. It might sound like, in hindsight, oh, that was a dumb idea to move the fleet guarding Vraks away, but it's just the way the Imperium works. There was no threat. There was no threat. The blockade had been established. The army on the ground, the enemy army on the ground, doesn't have any outside influences coming in to help them, and hasn't for a decade. Why are these ships still here? We need them other places. So, it sucks to suck, but it happens.
Although Battlefleet Scarus High Command was well aware that Raziak's force was not at all prepared for this in the slightest, he was ordered to mount a defense of Vraks nonetheless. In order not to panic the Admiral and his crew, Scarus High Command had not informed him that the Chaos Raid might potentially consist of more than 30 ships. But Admiral Raziak wasn't born yesterday. He had spent his entire career in the Navy, and he knew that if the entirety of Battlefleet Scarus was put on high alert, something serious must be going on. He immediately sent out his 3 Sword-class frigates to scout the outskirts of the Vraxian system, with strict orders to avoid engaging the enemy and to return upon contact with the main enemy force. The lack of crew was a large problem, as it would mean not all cannons would be operational during combat, and he would need all the firepower he could get. To solve this problem, he sent transport ships to the surface of Vraks to recruit manpower from the Manufactorum's labor corps. This would obviously hinder the 88th Siege Army logistics, but that would be a small price to pay if Raziak could keep the forces of Chaos from landing on Vraks. Right now, the Imperial Navy's need took precedence over the Departamenta Munitorum's, and so these laborers were enrolled as low-skilled personnel on the ship, helping to alleviate the worst of the manpower shortages on board. Alongside the search for extra personnel, Raziak checked all the available freighters in orbit around Vraks and inspected their combat capabilities. Although these ships were not designed for battle, it was not unlikely for a freighter to have at least some weapons on board for its own protection.
True.
Admiral Raziak was in luck. A massive bulk freighter called Isra Mors had finished unloading its cargo, and could be requisitioned into service immediately. It carried enough guns to fend off pirates and potentially even raiders. 2 other freighters, although smaller in size, were considered sufficiently armed enough as well. He sent over some of his experienced command personnel to get these ships battle-ready to serve in his defense fleet, should their assistance be required. He also ordered 3 other freighters to be stripped of weapons and personnel to supplement the other ships. He would have other plans for these now mostly empty vessels. He loaded them with anything explosive or flammable, turning each of them into huge bombs. Their cargo holds were packed, ready to explode, and their plasma reactor cores prepared to overdrive. These last 3 ships combined would serve as a squadron of fire ships that could ram the enemy and take them down in a huge explosion. Such a risky maneuver was not likely to succeed,
No.
but should it prove successful, a single fire ship could take down a vessel many times larger and more powerful than itself.
This is called making use of what you have. Because you don't have really any other option other than this.
The few remaining crew members required to steer the ship into the enemy were ordered to evacuate at the last moment, but everyone understood their chances of survival would be extremely slim. Finally, he ordered the 3 remaining defense monitors in the system to join the battle line. These battle stations had quite formidable firepower, but were extremely slow-moving. They would slow the Admiral's fleet down to a crawl, but their guns and strong defenses were desperately required. All in all, he had assembled a ragtag group of 13 ships under his command. His preparations had barely finished before he received a signal from one of the scouting Sword-class frigates. 3 Chaos ships had entered the Vraksian system, and their energy signals had confirmed them to be Infidel-class battleships. Raziak knew that this was just a probe for the larger enemy fleet, just some Chaos scouts testing his defenses and gathering
Infidels. Scouts. That hurts my feelings.
information. The Infidels did little more than skirt the battle line and did not risk coming into the range of the Lord Bellerophon's guns. But now they had observed Admiral Raziak's strength, or rather the lack of it, and finally left the system without firing a single shot. Before long, 14 Chaos ships bypassed the outer asteroid field and entered the Vraks system with full speed. As ordered, the Sword-class frigates returned to the battle line, barely managing to outpace the incoming attackers. These fast, traitorous vessels had split off from the main Chaos Armada in order to arrive at Vraks sooner. Whether the rest would follow later, remain outside the system, or hide in the asteroid belt, the Imperial Navy simply did not know. But although this wasn't the entire Chaos fleet, it would still outnumber and outgun Raziak's fleet considerably. Raziak broadcasted a final message of encouragement to the ships under his command. You are expected at all times to conduct yourself in a manner appropriate to the great duties and traditions of the Emperor's most glorious and honorable navy. Our orders demand nothing else. Look only to your duties, gentlemen. And with those words, their engines fired up all thrusters and his battle line came into motion. They would approach their enemy in a single line in an attempt to split up the enemy's formation. This would allow Raziak and his fleet to use all their available guns.
Again, I love how he's done this. I love how he's put this animation into play. This is so unbelievably well done. I can only take my hat off to it.
And inflict as much damage as possible on the approaching enemy. It would also spare his freighters and fire ships in the rear the brunt of the attack, and keep them operational for as long as possible. However, this formation would expose his ships to a lot of enemy guns from both sides. The Lord Bellerophon had the best void shields, and going up front, he could hopefully soak up most of the punishment.
Tanking.
The Lord Bellerophon sent out a flurry of 6 torpedoes in front of his fleet to force open the enemy formation. The Chaos fleet did in fact start evasive maneuvers and split up into 2 groups, trying to surround the Loyalist fleet from both sides. 3 torpedoes were shot down, 2 of them missed their targets, but 1 had a successful lock onto an enemy destroyer and detonated against its hull in a devastating explosion.
Nice.
The ship was fatally wounded and dropped out of the battle line. First blood went to the Imperium.
Hooray!
Although the Admiral was well aware of the pounding he was soon about to receive in return, at least his strategy did seem to go to plan. But then a report came in that the leading heretic flagship was in fact the Anarchy's Heart, a despoiler-class battleship. The very same one that had brought Lord Arcos and his warband to Vraks several years ago.
This is bad.
Up until this point, Admiral Raziak had considered his chances of survival slim, but with this new information, he might as well consider himself a dead man walking.
Screwed.
The ancient despoiler-class battleship outgunned the Lord Bellerophon considerably. It had enough firepower to challenge the entirety of Raziak's ragtag fleet by itself.
Yeah.
They were going to be torn apart. But nonetheless, the Admiral would pursue his strategy and continued its course straight through the middle of the Traitors' formation. The two fleets slid past each other in a murderous gun battle. It was a vicious duel and both sides were taking heavy damage. The Anarchy's Heart and its fleet had raked the entirety of Raziak's battle line with broad volleys and lance salvos. The Lord Bellerophon's void shields had protected it against the first blows, but before long it gave out and several of its decks were destroyed. Its communication tower had been blown right off, leaving the Admiral unable to communicate with the rest of his fleet. But their orders had been clear. Follow the Lord Bellerophon through the enemy's gauntlet and inflict as much damage on the enemy as possible. Soon, one of the sword-class frigates was crippled and floated helplessly adrift. Two of the defense monitors, having soaked up a lot of the punishment, were completely destroyed and dead in the void. The two smaller freighters had miraculously remained relatively unscathed, but the Aizramore's plasma reactors had been hit, disabling the large freighter's thrusters and leaving her unable to move forward. But despite the damage, the captain of the Aizramores ordered all remaining power to the gun batteries and continued firing on the enemy. But to Raziak's surprise, two of the enemy's ships at the rear guard had staved off engagement and turned about. With his communications destroyed, the Admiral had no idea that reinforcements had arrived. Battlefleet Scarus had directed the small cruiser group of 5 ships under command of Admiral Mazur and his flagship, the Consul of Thraciae. Unbeknownst to either side, it had arrived shortly after the traitors' fleet crossed the asteroid field. Together they could swing the battle in the Imperium's favor.
Yay!
The first to detect them had been the rearmost Chaos cruisers, and they had taken immediate action to intercept. Mazur's task was to cut off the enemy's approach and prevent a planetary landing. Mazur and Raziak had been long-standing rivals within the Imperial Navy, and Mazur didn't feel much for coming to the other admiral's rescue. Instead, he steered his flagship straight for the Anarchy's Heart while his escorts took care of the incoming Chaos ships.
Oh boy.
But if he planned to stop the enemy from disembarking, he unfortunately arrived too late. The Anarchy's Heart and several other traitor ships were already preparing themselves to enter Vraks's lower orbit to deliver their reinforcements onto the planet. The 3 fire ships saw their opportunity to strike. They moved full speed into the Chaos vessels entering Vraks's orbit. It was a brave gamble, but coming under heavy fire, 2 of them never made it to their targets and exploded harmlessly into space. The 3rd, however, rammed a large Chaos transport called the Acheron's Bane and dealt a crippling blow. Already caught in Vraks's grasp.
It's time for that nice long fall. It's gonna be a hot one, baby.
The ship had no possibility of escape and was being pulled further into orbit. It burned through the atmosphere, about to crash land onto the planet. But by some miracle during its descent, it managed to steer itself somewhat upright, and although it impacted with the planet's surface, some of its heretical crew and cargo would survive the crash. Meanwhile, the Anarchy's Heart already sent hundreds of Dreadclaw drop pods and landing craft down to Vraks, carrying many warbands of Chaos Space Marines to the war below.
That's
Mazur
never a good
realized
sign.
He was too late. But he still raced onwards in the hope of destroying the mighty Chaos battleship. Behind him, his battle group traded blows with the Chaos fleet, taking heavy damage in the process. 2 of his escorts had already been destroyed. Receiving no response from his requests to Admiral Raziak, but instead seeing the remaining ships of his ally leave the system, Mazur ordered his own battle group to disengage and retreat. It appeared to him that Raziak had abandoned him, so he made sure his own retreating battle group would bring a report to the Navy's Council on Cypramundi about his allies' betrayal. In reality, however, Admiral Raziak had little choice. His own ships had taken crippling damage, and the Lord Bellerophon completely lost its ability to communicate. Even if he wanted to, he could not have ordered a rendezvous to re-engage the Chaos Fleet. Now Admiral Mazur single-handedly attempted to assault and ram the enemy battleship, but he wouldn't come far. Being about the only Imperial vessel still in the fight, the Chaos vessels focused their fire on it and tore it asunder. The battle had turned...
He died literally because he was too much of an idiot to see that he was outgunned.
The immediate space around Vraks into a graveyard of burnt-out hulks. All Imperial ships had been either damaged or destroyed outright, and the abandoned Isra Moors was in the process of being captured and added to the Chaos Fleet. The Chaos forces had lost the crash-landed transport Acheron's Bane and 4 raiding ships, but had seized complete control of the Vraxian system, and were now free to unload their unholy troops and cargo onto the planet. The formidable Chaos Armada had been drawn to Lord Arcos' psychic beacon on Vraks, and with great haste they had successfully evaded an Imperial Navy interception. Now warbands of Cornate Berserkers, the Alpha Legion, and Iron Warriors were amongst the first to make planetfall and assault the Death Corps forces. And many more drop pods and transports would soon follow, continuing to rain down onto the surface below. The 88th Siege Army, through no fault of their own, was in grave danger.
Oh yeah.
The hard-earned victories that had brought them so close to the Vraxian Citadel were about to be overturned.
Okay. For anyone who isn't familiar with this battle and is harboring some sort of illusion that the massive amount of Vraks troops are going to be able to hold against this, remember that your standard Space Marines are going to drastically outmatch them to the point where it's a thing that is known within the 40k community that a full chapter, 1,000 Space Marines landing on a planet, is more than enough to legitimately take it over in most cases. 1,000 Space Marines landing on a planet is such a massive impact. It is beyond overkill. But in the same circumstances, in that same breath, the one thing about Chaos Space Marines, they lack a lot of the things that initially made them great. Especially in the case of like the Emperor's Children and a few other of the legions like the Night Lords, and I would say the World Eaters, but come on, man. The World Eaters were always screwed up. You would need more Traitor Space Marines to take Vraks than you would Loyalists, but at the same time, it's still a really bad sign once you start seeing drop pods falling from the sky. Guys, we're going to be checking out the next video soon. I know that he's working on Vraks Part 13, and I really can't wait to see it. But until we get caught up, I will catch you guys next time. Subscribe to Janovich if you haven't already. Check out my links. You ever have that happen? Check out my links in the description down below. Get yourself some merch, and I'll catch you guys next time. Battleship go brrr.